I am Claire, 35 years old, and somehow still untangling the web of deception my family spun around me. When I was 29, I quietly put my entire multi-million-dollar inheritance into an irrevocable trust. The very next morning, my parents took my house, or at least they tried to. I stepped out onto my porch in my robe and watched them stare in horror at the man waiting inside. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic relatives who thought they could walk all over you. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago, I learned early on that my worth in our family was entirely conditional. As a financial analyst, I spent my days dealing with hard numbers and logical projections, but at home the rules were always shifting to favor one person. My younger brother Brandon was 33 years old and the undisputed golden child. He could do no wrong in the eyes of my parents, Patricia and Richard. I, on the other hand, was merely the family safety net, the responsible daughter expected to absorb the impact of his constant failures. The night before the ambush had been my 29th birthday. My family had not called to wish me well. They had not sent a card. I had spent the evening having a quiet dinner with a few close friends celebrating the finalization of the legal documents that would secure my future. I woke up the next morning not to a belated birthday text, but to the harsh grinding sound of a heavy diesel engine idling right outside my bedroom window. I walked downstairs, tied the belt of my robe, and opened my front door. The air was crisp and unseasonably cold for early October. I stood on my mahogany porch, the chill seeping through my slippers, trying to process the scene unfolding on my manicured lawn. A massive moving truck was backing into my driveway. A crew of 4 burly men in matching uniforms were already lowering the metal ramp. My mother, Patricia, stood at the base of the porch steps, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. Beside her was my father, Richard, looking entirely too comfortable directing the workers toward my front door. And there, leaning against the hood of an expensive sports car that my parents definitely paid for, was Brandon. "What is going on here?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level despite the sudden pounding in my chest. My mother stepped forward. A tight, victorious smile stretched across her face. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a crisp sheet of paper, waving it lightly in the morning breeze. "Pack your things, Claire," she said, her tone dripping with the kind of artificial sweetness she usually reserved for charity galas. "This house belongs to Brandon now. We needed the cash flow, and you have always been so adaptable. You can easily find a small apartment closer to your office." I stared at her, letting the sheer audacity of her words wash over me. The house we were standing in, a stunning Victorian property in one of the city's best neighborhoods, had been left directly to me by my grandmother, Beatrice. She had passed away just 3 months prior, and unlike my parents, she had seen right through Brandon. She knew leaving her estate to my parents meant it would be squandered on his terrible business ideas. Brandon pushed off his car and sauntered up the steps, jingling a familiar set of brass keys in his hand. He had clearly copied the emergency spare I gave my parents years ago. "Come on, sis, do not make this difficult," he smirked, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Jasmine is pregnant and we need the space. You are single. You do not need 4 bedrooms and a custom kitchen just to eat takeout in. We have already hired decorators to come in this afternoon." I looked past his smug face to his wife Jasmine, who was lingering near the passenger side of the car. Jasmine was 32, an incredibly talented African-American architect who always seemed entirely too grounded for my brother. Right now, she was refusing to meet my eyes, staring fixedly at the pavement while wrapping her arms around her stomach, looking profoundly uncomfortable with this entire ambush. "You are trying to evict me from my own home?" I asked, looking directly at my father, hoping to find a single shred of reason. Richard sighed, putting on his best disappointed father face. "Now, Claire, let us be reasonable. Your grandmother made a mistake when she drafted that will. She was not thinking clearly at the end. Brandon has a growing family to support. He has his new business venture to get off the ground. We filed the paperwork to correct the deed transfer this morning. We are just reallocating family resources where they are needed most. You make a good salary. You will be fine." Reallocating family resources. That was their sanitized term for theft. It was the exact same justification they used when I was 23 working entry-level hours. They had guilted me into co-signing a massive loan for Brandon's first failed tech startup. They promised to make the payments. Instead, they let it default, tanking my credit score for years, while Brandon drove around in a brand new luxury vehicle. I spent my mid-20s eating rice and beans to pay off a debt I never benefited from, while my parents endlessly praised his entrepreneurial spirit. My mother actually had the nerve to peer past me through the open door, pointing a manicured finger at my entryway console. "We will need to have that awful rug removed before the decorators arrive," she murmured to Richard. "It simply does not suit the aesthetic Brandon and Jasmine are going for." I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional breakdown. I had spent my entire life crying over their blatant favoritism, and I was entirely out of tears. Instead, I simply took a deep breath of the cold morning air, tightened the belt of my robe, and stepped aside, holding the front door wide open. "Well then," I said, gesturing into the entryway, "if you are the new owners, you should probably come inside and meet your house guest." Brandon frowned, his smirk faltering slightly as he exchanged a confused glance with our mother. He stepped past me into the foyer, Patricia and Richard hot on his heels. They marched toward the kitchen, likely expecting to find a friend or a date I would have to embarrassingly explain away. Instead, they stopped dead in their tracks. Sitting at my custom marble kitchen island, calmly sipping an espresso, was Mr. Davies. He was known throughout the state as the most ruthless, ironclad estate attorney money could buy. He had been my grandmother's personal lawyer for 2 decades, and I had invited him over for an early breakfast to review the final physical copies of my portfolio transfer. "That is funny, Mom," I said, walking up behind them and leaning against the doorframe. "Because as of 11:59 last night, this house and the entirety of Grandma Beatrice's estate are locked into a blind, irrevocable trust. And Mr. Davies here is the legally appointed trustee." Mr. Davies set his espresso cup down on the saucer with a sharp click that echoed in the silent kitchen. He slowly stood up, straightening his immaculate suit jacket. "Good morning, Patricia Richard," he said, his voice smooth and deadly. "As the trustee of the Beatrice Sterling Heritage Trust, I must inform you that you currently hold no legal claim to this property or any other asset formerly belonging to Beatrice. Furthermore, you are currently trespassing on corporate assets. I suggest you tell your moving crew to pack up and leave before I call the authorities and have you all escorted off the premises in handcuffs." The color completely drained from my mother's face. My father took a step back, bumping into Brandon, whose brass keys suddenly slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the realization that their carefully planned theft had just spectacularly imploded. Mr. Davies rose with a deliberate slowness that commanded the room. He didn't raise his voice yet. The sheer authority in his tone caused everyone, even my usually blustering father, to pause. Under Section 402 of the State Property Code, he began, his gaze fixing Richard in place. "Any unauthorized attempt to enter or seize assets held within a legally registered blind trust constitutes criminal trespass, potentially elevating to attempted burglary, given the presence of a moving crew. You are currently standing on property owned by the Beatrice Sterling Heritage Trust. As the appointed trustee, I am formally demanding you vacate the premises immediately. If you do not, my next call is to the police dispatcher, and I assure you, Richard, a squad car will be here in less than 4 minutes." The moving crew, who had been lingering awkwardly on the porch, suddenly found extreme interest in their shoelaces. The foreman, a burly guy with a clipboard, held up his hands and began backing down the steps. "We don't want any legal trouble, lady," he mumbled, signaling his crew. They practically sprinted to their truck, the diesel engine roaring to life before Richard could even formulate a response. My father's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He lunged forward, trying to muscle past me into the foyer. "I'm your father, Claire," he bellowed. "I don't care what some overpriced suit says, this is family business." Mr. Davies didn't flinch. He stepped neatly between Richard and me, producing a sleek black cell phone from his breast pocket and tapping the screen. One more step, Richard, and I pressed dial. he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. I suggest you reconsider your next move very carefully. Richard froze, his fists clenched, the bluster instantly deflating under the threat of public humiliation. A police scene on the front lawn of the neighborhood he was so desperate to impress was his ultimate nightmare. Patricia, however, was not so easily deterred. She stepped around Richard, her eyes blazing with the fury I had known my entire life. "You are stealing from this family, Claire!" she shrieked, all pretense of her country club elegance vanishing. "How dare you manipulate a dying woman? We needed this property. Brandon needed this property. You are a selfish, spiteful girl who is taking money straight out of your brother's pockets." I felt my jaw tighten. The lifetime of conditioning to stay quiet, to smooth things over, to absorb the blame flared up, but I pushed it down. I looked right at her, matching her volume. "Stealing," I echoed the word, tasting bitter. "Just like I stole the $40,000 you forced me to co-sign for Brandon's failed app when I was 23. The loan you swore you'd help him pay, but instead let default while he bought a brand new Audi. You ruined my credit for 5 years, Mom. I ate rice and beans in a studio apartment while you praised his entrepreneurial spirit." Grandma Beatrice saw exactly what was happening. She didn't leave this to me because she was manipulated. She left it to me because she knew I was the only one who wouldn't hand it over to fund Brandon's next disaster. Brandon, who had been hovering near his car, suddenly looked very interested in the pavement. Jasmine, his wife, snapped her head up, staring at Brandon with wide, horrified eyes. "40,000!" Jasmine whispered, her voice barely carrying over the idling moving truck. "You told me that was a small business grant." Brandon shushed her, grabbing her arm, but the damage was done. The facade was cracking. Patricia ignored the exchange between her son and daughter-in-law, her focus entirely on destroying me. She pointed a trembling finger at my face. "You listen to me, Claire. We will see you in court. We will have that trust broken, and we will take everything. You have always been a selfish disappointment, and I will make sure everyone knows exactly what you've done." I didn't blink. "Then you'd better start dialing Mom because I have coffee getting cold." I shut the heavy oak door firmly in her face, the solid click of the deadbolt echoing in the quiet foyer. For a second, there was silence, save for the muffled sound of my father yelling at Brandon outside, followed by the screech of tires as their car peeled away. I let out a shaky breath, leaning my forehead against the cool wood of the door. I had done it. I had actually stood up to them, but the victory was short-lived. My phone resting on the entryway console buzzed with a sharp, insistent notification. I picked it up, expecting a vitriolic text from Patricia. Instead, it was an automated alert from my primary bank. "Alert. Suspicious activity detected. Your checking and savings accounts ending in 4402 have been temporarily frozen pending a legal review. Please contact customer service immediately." I stared at the screen, the words blurring. They hadn't just come for the house. They had already launched their second attack. I turned back to Mr. Davies, who was watching me closely. "They froze my accounts," I said, my voice tight. "My personal accounts. All my cash." Mr. Davies sighed, gesturing for me to join him back in the kitchen. "Let's sit down, Claire. We have a lot of work to do, and I need to show you exactly what we're up against." I followed him, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly giving way to a cold, pragmatic dread. I sat opposite him at the island, the espresso machine, humming softly in the background. "First things first," Mr. Davies said, opening his briefcase and pulling out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He slid it across the marble counter toward me. "The accounts they froze are your personal liquid assets. Annoying, yes, but ultimately irrelevant to our larger strategy. The trust operates entirely independently of your personal finances." I opened the envelope. Inside was a sleek black corporate credit card bearing my name and the insignia of a major international bank. "This draws directly from the trust's operational funds," he explained. "Your personal accounts are frozen, but you are not without resources. Now, as for why they were able to freeze them so quickly..." He reached back into his briefcase and produced a manila folder, setting it down with a heavy thud. He didn't look triumphant. He looked grim. "They didn't just try to evict you this morning, Claire," he said quietly. "Your father filed this yesterday afternoon in the county probate court. It's the reason I insisted on being here today." I pulled the file toward me, my stomach dropping as I read the title printed on the first page. Petition for conservatorship. I read the opening paragraphs, the legal jargon failing to mask the sheer malice of the document. Richard and Patricia Sterling were petitioning the court to gain total control over my life, my finances, and my medical decisions. They were claiming I was mentally unfit, unstable, and a danger to myself and my assets. They're using the depression, I whispered, staring at a specific paragraph detailing a difficult period during my junior year of college. When I was 20, I had struggled with severe burnout and depression exacerbated by the constant pressure and emotional manipulation from my parents. I had seen a therapist for 6 months. They were now twisting that brief, resolved episode into a narrative of chronic, debilitating mental illness. They are attempting to paint a picture of a woman incapable of managing a sudden, massive windfall, Mr. Davies confirmed. They are arguing that you manipulated your grandmother while in an erratic state of mind and that the trust should be dissolved and placed under their control for your own protection. The freezing of your accounts is a standard temporary measure granted by a judge pending the initial hearing. I closed the folder, the reality of their betrayal sinking in deeper than ever before. They weren't just trying to take the money, they were trying to erase my autonomy entirely. They wanted to turn me back into the obedient, voiceless safety net they had always demanded I be. They really think I'm going to roll over, I said, tracing the edge of the corporate card. They think because they filed some paperwork and yelled on my porch, I'm going to panic and hand it all over. Mr. Davies leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. The question isn't what they think, Claire. The question is, how do you want to proceed? We can defend the trust passively, or we can go on the offensive. I looked at the corporate card, then at the petition claiming I was broken and incapable. I thought about the $40,000, the ruined credit, the decades of being told I wasn't enough, while Brandon was handed everything. I picked up the black card. We go on the offensive, I said. I want them to realize exactly whose house they tried to break into. Mr. Davies nodded his approval. He packed his briefcase with precise movements, detailing the exact legal motions he would file by noon to counter their conservatorship petition. Once he walked out the front door, the silence of the house felt entirely different. It was no longer a sanctuary, but a fortress. I had drawn a line in the sand, and I knew my family would not hesitate to cross it. Within an hour, my phone began vibrating continuously against the marble counter. Patricia was wasting no time. I opened my messages to a flood of vitriol from aunts, uncles, and family friends. My mother had spun a masterful narrative. According to her frantic social media posts and mass texts, I was experiencing a severe psychological break. She claimed I had manipulated my dying grandmother into signing over her entire estate in her final confused days. Worse, she painted a picture of me aggressively evicting Brandon, his pregnant wife, and their future child onto the street without warning. The sheer volume of messages was suffocating. People I had not spoken to in years were suddenly experts on my mental health and moral failings. They called me greedy, ungrateful, and unhinged. The screen flashed with an incoming call from my cousin Sarah. Sarah was the family gossip, the primary node in Patricia Whisper Network. I answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear. "Claire, what is wrong with you?" Sarah demanded, her voice shrill with manufactured outrage. "Aunt Patricia is in tears. How could you steal from your own family and throw your brother out of his house? You need to do the right thing and sign that property back over to Brandon before you destroy this family permanently." I did not raise my voice. I leaned against the kitchen counter, my grip on the phone tightening. "Destroy the family," I repeated. "That is interesting, Sarah. Where was this deep concern for family unity when I was 23? Where were your frantic phone calls when Brandon defaulted on his $40,000 app loan and left me to deal with the collections agencies? I worked 3 jobs and sold my car to keep myself out of bankruptcy while Brandon took a luxury ski trip to Aspen. Did you call him then and tell him to do the right thing?" Sarah sputtered, clearly caught off guard. "That was different. He was just finding himself. You are trying to leave a pregnant woman homeless. I am protecting my own property from trespassers," I stated firmly. "Do not call me again unless you are ready to pay me back the money this family cost me." I ended the call and blocked her number. I proceeded to block every single relative who had sent a harassing message. I would not allow them to drain my energy. I walked into my home office to start my workday, but as I opened my laptop, a new email popped up. It was marked urgent from my department director, Marcus. The subject line simply read, "Emergency Meeting." My stomach clenched. I immediately joined the requested video call. Marcus looked deeply uncomfortable. "Claire, I received a very disturbing phone call this morning from your father." He began rubbing the back of his neck. "Richard expressed serious concerns about your current mental stability. He mentioned you are going through a severe manic episode and suggested that we grant you an immediate indefinite leave of absence for your own safety and the safety of our firm. My parents were trying to cut off my income. They wanted to strip away my professional credibility, knowing that my career was the only thing I had built completely independent of their influence. If I lost my job, I would lose the very foundation of my independence, making their conservatorship claim look entirely justified to a judge. I did not panic. I sat up straight, looking directly into the camera. "Marcus, I appreciate your concern, but my father is currently attempting to illegally seize a trust fund my grandmother left me. When I stopped him this morning, he decided to retaliate by weaponizing my professional reputation. I am perfectly fine. To prove it, let me share my screen." I pulled up the comprehensive financial analysis for the massive corporate merger our firm was facilitating. I had been lead analyst on the project for 6 months. I walked Marcus through the complex data models, the risk assessment matrices, and the projected quarterly yields. I highlighted a critical discrepancy I had found in the acquiring company liabilities that would save our client millions. I spoke with absolute clarity, demonstrating an undeniable command of the facts and figures. When I finished the presentation, Marcus was silent for a long moment. He shook his head, letting out a heavy breath. "Your work is flawless, Claire. As always. I apologize for bringing this up, but human resources required me to follow through when a family member calls with a medical concern. I will note in your file that the claims were unsubstantiated and that your performance remains exemplary. Your father will not be put through to this office again." I thanked him and ended the call. I had secured my job and my professional reputation. Another one of their traps had been dismantled. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling a breath I felt like I had been holding all morning. Then my personal cell phone lit up on the desk. It was a text message from a number I rarely saw. It was Jasmine, my brother wife. The preview of the message made my blood run cold. "Claire, I need to talk to you right now. Brandon does not know I am messaging you. It is bad." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, my heart hammering a sudden frantic rhythm against my ribs. Jasmine and I had never been close. My parents had made absolutely certain of that by constantly positioning me as the jealous spinster sister while placing Jasmine on an unreachable pedestal. They used her successful career and her picture-perfect marriage to Brandon as a weapon to highlight my supposed inadequacies. But her reaching out to me in secret meant the meticulously constructed facade of my brother was finally shattering from the inside out. I typed back a quick reply, suggesting a small independent coffee shop on the opposite side of town, far away from the upscale neighborhoods my parents frequented. I told her to park in the alley behind the building and to make sure she was not followed. I grabbed my keys and my briefcase, leaving the heavy silence of my house behind. 20 minutes later, I walked through the glass doors of the cafe. The scent of roasted beans and vanilla hit me, but my focus was entirely on the back booth. Jasmine was already there. The sight of her made me stop in my tracks. My sister-in-law was usually the epitome of polished elegance. Today she looked thoroughly broken. She wore a rumpled, oversized sweater that hid her small baby bump, and her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. She was staring blankly at an untouched cup of chamomile tea, her hands shaking so badly that the cup rattled against the saucer. I slid into the booth across from her, placing my briefcase gently on the wooden table. Jasmine looked up, her eyes swimming with fresh tears. "Claire, I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I swear to you, I had no idea what they were planning this morning. I did not know they were trying to throw you out. I kept my voice calm and gentle, pushing a napkin toward her. Take a breath, Jasmine. Tell me exactly what Patricia and Richard told you. She wiped her eyes, taking a shuddering breath. Patricia called me last week, bubbling with excitement. She told me your grandmother had left the Beacon Hill house to a general family trust. She said you were thrilled to be relocating to a modern luxury condo closer to your office, and that you wanted to gift the house to the baby. She even brought over paint samples and fabric swatches for the nursery. Brandon went along with every single word. When we pulled into your driveway this morning, I thought we were walking into an empty house. When you opened the door and I saw your face, I realized they had lied to me about everything. I felt a sickening twist in my stomach. The depth of my mother's delusion was staggering. She had not just planned to steal my inheritance, she had actively constructed a fantasy world to make herself look like a benevolent matriarch to her daughter-in-law. I believe you, Jasmine, I said softly. But you did not risk sneaking out to meet me just to apologize for this morning. You said it was bad. What is going on? Jasmine let out a hollow, bitter laugh that sounded entirely devoid of joy. Brandon is ruined, Claire. He is completely, fundamentally ruined, and your parents are going down with him. I leaned forward, my financial analyst instincts immediately overriding my shock. Explain it to me. She reached into her large leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope, setting it between us. I knew his architectural consulting firm was struggling, she began, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He told me the market was slow and clients were delaying payments. But he was still leaving for the office every morning in a tailored suit. He was still buying expensive watches and taking clients out to lavish steak dinners. But this morning, after we left your house, Brandon and your father got into a screaming match in the driveway. It was vicious. They were shouting about deadlines and foreclosures. When Brandon stormed out to clear his head, I broke into the locked filing cabinet in his home office. She pushed the envelope toward me. He does not have a business, Claire. He has not had a single paying client in 8 months. The money he has been spending, the lifestyle he has been projecting it, is all a complete sham. Where is the money going? I asked, pulling the stack of bank statements from the envelope. The gambling. Jasmine sobbed, covering her face with her hands. It is sports betting. High-stakes online poker. Offshore crypto casinos. He has a severe addiction. I looked at the statements, and my blood ran cold. The numbers were staggering. He was dropping $10,000 on a single football game. He was transferring massive sums to unregulated overseas accounts. He owes over $200,000. Jasmine continued, her voice muffled behind her hands. And he has not paid a dime of income tax in 3 years. The IRS sent a notice of intent to levy his accounts. He hid all the mail from me. I stared at the heavily redacted statements, trying to make the math work in my head. If he has not had income in 8 months and he is hundreds of thousands of dollars in the hole, where did he get the cash to keep up appearances this long? Jasmine lowered her hands, looking at me with absolute despair. Your parents, they bailed him out again. But this time, they went too far. I found the loan documents mixed in with his casino debts. Richard and Patricia secretly took out a massive second mortgage on their own home 6 months ago. They drained their retirement accounts completely dry. They funneled every single penny directly to Brandon, thinking it would save his business. Instead, he gambled it all away in a matter of weeks. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The pieces of their psychotic puzzle finally snapped together in my mind. They are bankrupt, I whispered, staring blankly at the table. My parents are completely tapped out. Jasmine nodded, wiping her cheeks. The bank is preparing to foreclose on their house, Claire. They are going to lose everything. Brandon promised them that if they could just keep him afloat a little longer, Grandma Beatrice would pass away and leave the entire estate to him. He promised he would use the inheritance to pay off their second mortgage and clear his debts. When Beatrice left everything to you, they panicked. They needed your house. They planned to force you out, take the property, and immediately liquidate it to stop the banks from seizing their own home. Suddenly, the conservatorship petition made perfect, terrifying sense. It was not just petty vindictiveness. It was a desperate, frenzied grab for survival. If they could convince a judge that I was mentally incompetent, my father would be appointed as my legal guardian. He would gain total, unchecked access to the Beatrice Sterling Heritage Trust. He would sell off my grandmother, commercial real estate drain the stock portfolios, and use my inheritance to cover up his own financial ruin and save his golden boy from the consequences of his crimes. They were willing to lock me away in a legal cage and strip me of my human rights just to maintain their country club facade. "I am leaving him, Claire," Jasmine said, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice was suddenly firm, stripped of the tears and panic. "I refuse to bring a child into this nightmare. I am going to stay with my sister across the state. I am filing for divorce the second I get there. But I could not leave without warning you. They are desperate, and desperate people do not stop just because you locked a door." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You are doing the right thing, Jasmine. You have to protect yourself and your baby. Do not look back." She offered a small, sad smile. "Before I go, there is one more thing you need to see." She reached back into her tote bag and retrieved a smaller bundle held together by a thick rubber band. "I found these stuffed into the spare tire compartment in the trunk of Brandon's car," she explained, dropping the bundle onto the table. "He has been hiding them for months." I picked up the bundle. It was a stack of at least a dozen thick envelopes. Across the front of each envelope, stamped in bold, aggressive red ink, were the words, "Final notice and legal action pending." "It is the lease for his downtown office space," Jasmine said, shaking her head. "The one he pretends to go to every day. He has not paid his commercial rent in 6 months. The landlord is initiating lockout procedures and suing him for breach of contract." I slid the rubber band off the stack and looked at the top envelope. I expected to feel a surge of pity, but my eyes snagged on the return address printed in the top left corner. Apex Commercial Properties, LLC. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the logo, a stylized geometric mountain peak. The name was incredibly familiar. It was the exact same company name I had read just 2 hours ago sitting at my kitchen island with Mr. Davies. It was the primary holding company listed on the first page of my grandmother portfolio. I carefully opened my briefcase and pulled out the thick legal binder Mr. Davies had left with me. I flipped past the residential deeds and the stock holdings, stopping at the commercial real estate annex. I ran my finger down the list of corporate entities wholly owned and operated by the Beatrice Sterling Heritage Trust. There it was, Apex Commercial Properties, LLC. I looked back at the eviction notice in my hand, and then up at Jasmine. A slow, cold realization washed over me, replacing the shock and anger with a sharp, calculating clarity. Brandon had been hiding these notices, assuming my parents would eventually bail him out of this debt too. He had absolutely no idea who actually owned the building he was leasing. "Jasmine," I said slowly, my voice carrying a new dangerous edge, "does Brandon know who owns his office building?" She shook her head, looking confused. "No, he deals with some faceless property management group. Why does it matter?" I carefully placed the stack of eviction notices into my briefcase right next to my pristine black corporate card. Because I said, a genuine smile touching my lips for the first time all day. "That worthless office building belongs to the trust. I am his landlord." Jasmine stared at me, her eyes wide, taking in the magnitude of what I had just said. The fear that had been gripping her seemed to dissolve, replaced by a stunned kind of clarity. I slid the eviction notices back into my briefcase and snapped it shut. Brandon had built his entire adult life on the assumption that someone else would always pick up his tab. He thought my parents were his ultimate safety net, but they had mortgaged their own survival to fund his delusion. Now the net was gone, and he was in freefall. I told Jasmine to take whatever she needed and get to her sister house safely. I promised her that the trust attorneys would handle the commercial lease termination strictly by the book, keeping her name completely out of the crossfire. We walked out of the coffee shop through the back alley and went our separate ways. The crisp afternoon air felt different now. The crushing anxiety of the morning ambush had entirely burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp focus. My personal bank accounts were still frozen thanks to my father desperate conservatorship filing. I had the corporate trust card for immediate expenses, but I needed to ensure my upcoming salary and any pending bonuses were completely isolated from the frozen accounts. I drove straight to the main branch of my bank downtown. The grand marble lobby was relatively quiet, with only a few customers speaking in hushed tones to the tellers. I approached the desk of a senior banker I had dealt with for years. She looked at me with an apologetic grimace, clearly aware of the freeze on my checking and savings profiles. I did not give her time to offer empty sympathies. I handed her the authorized trust documentation and requested a complete rerouting of all my future direct deposits into the secure operational accounts managed by Mr. Davies. It was a straightforward administrative task, but it effectively walled off my only remaining vulnerability. As I sat in the leather chair waiting for the paperwork to process, a sudden loud voice shattered the quiet atmosphere of the bank. I do not care what your screen says. I am listed as a primary account holder, and I demand a withdrawal immediately. I froze. I knew that voice. I turned my head slightly, looking past the frosted glass partition of my cubicle. Standing at one of the main teller windows, aggressively tapping his fingers on the marble counter, was my father. Richard was red in the face, wearing a golf shirt and slacks, looking like a man who had just rushed over in a state of absolute panic. The young teller looked terrified but held her ground. Sir, as I explained, that account status is inactive. I cannot authorize a withdrawal of any amount, let alone a cashier check for $50,000. He needs cash, I realized. He needs cash to stop his own house from going into foreclosure. He had probably spent the morning bouncing between banks trying to find any hidden pockets of liquidity after discovering my primary accounts were legally frozen and untouchable even to him. Now he was trying to pull money from the ghost of our financial past. Richard slammed his palm flat against the counter. Do not tell me it is inactive. My daughter Claire Sterling set up that joint account with me years ago. I am her father. I am currently filing for legal conservatorship over her estate due to her mental instability. I have every right to access those funds to cover her medical and legal expenses. The sheer audacity of his lie made my blood boil. He was standing in a public place loudly declaring me mentally incompetent so he could steal money to cover Brandon gambling debts. I stood up from my chair, thanked my banker for her help, and walked directly out into the main lobby. I stopped 10 feet behind Richard, crossing my arms over my chest. Are you having trouble making a withdrawal, Dad? I asked, my voice echoing slightly off the high ceilings. Richard whipped around, his eyes widening in shock before quickly narrowing into a glare. Several other customers turned to watch the commotion. He immediately tried to seize control of the narrative, stepping toward me and raising his voice so everyone could hear. Claire, what are you doing here? He demanded, adopting a tone of exaggerated paternal concern. You should be resting. We are all very worried about your current state. You have not been acting like yourself, and frankly, stealing from your brother this morning proves you are not well. I'm just trying to secure your assets before you do something you regret. He was trying to humiliate me into submission, banking on the fact that I had always hated public confrontations. He expected me to shrink away, to lower my eyes and rush out the door. Instead, I stepped closer, adjusting the strap of my briefcase. I looked past him to the terrified teller. Could you remind my father when that specific joint account was closed? I asked her, keeping my tone polite and conversational. The teller swallowed hard, glancing at her screen. The account was permanently closed 3 years ago, Mom. I turned my attention back to Richard, who suddenly looked like he had swallowed a stone. 3 years ago, Dad, I repeated clearly and loudly enough for the security guard near the door to hear. Right after you used your joint access to quietly drain $20,000 of my hard-earned savings to pay for Brandon lavish wedding catering. You wiped me out without asking and told me I was being selfish when I cried about it. I closed that account the very next morning. So good luck finding anything left to steal today. Richard's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He opened his mouth to shout, but the words failed him. He realized in real time that his public performance had backfired spectacularly. The other customers were now staring at him with undisguised disgust. The security guard took a slow, deliberate step in our direction. I did not wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked out the glass double doors, leaving him fuming and empty-handed in the middle of the lobby. The very next morning, I sat in the austere conference room of Mr. Davies' law firm. The massive mahogany table was covered in neat stacks of documents. The conservatorship hearing was scheduled for the end of the week, and we were building an impenetrable fortress of evidence. Mr. Davies slid a thick folder toward me. I have pulled the complete history of Brandon co-signed app loan, including the default notices addressed to you and the concurrent bank statements showing your parents purchasing his luxury vehicle. I also have the sworn statements from your grandmother, primary physicians, confirming her absolute mental clarity on the day she established your trust. I pulled the eviction notices I had taken from Jasmine out of my briefcase and placed them on the table. Add these to the pile, I said. Brandon is 6 months behind on his commercial rent for his office space. The building is owned by Apex Commercial Properties, which is part of the trust. He has no idea I am his landlord. Mr. Davies adjusted his glasses, looking at the notices with a predatory smile. Excellent. We will not use these defensively. We will use them to completely dismantle their claim of financial responsibility. They are attempting to argue that you are unfit to manage money, while they are actively shielding a son who is hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. We will let them paint their masterpiece in the courtroom, and then we will set it on fire. For the next 3 days, the silence from my parents was deafening. There were no more ambushes on my porch, no more harassing calls to my boss, no more public confrontations. They were preparing for court, believing they held the ultimate trump card with their medical claims. On Thursday night, just hours before the hearing, I was sitting in my living room going over my financial ledgers. My phone screen lit up with an incoming email. The sender was Patricia. I opened the message knowing it would be a masterpiece of manipulation. Claire, I am writing this because I love you, and my heart is breaking for our family. Tomorrow is going to be terrible for everyone. Having to stand in front of a judge and detail your mental health struggles breaks my heart. But your father and I feel we have no other choice to protect you from yourself. However, we are willing to forgive everything that has happened this week. We will withdraw the conservatorship petition first thing tomorrow morning. All you have to do is sign the Beacon Hill house over to Brandon and transfer 50% of the trust liquid cash to your father to manage on your behalf. Please do the right thing and let us be a family again. We just want to help you. Love, Mom. The sheer arrogance of the email was breathtaking. She was holding a loaded gun to my head and calling it a peace offering. She truly believed I was still the terrified little girl who would give up everything just to avoid making them angry. She thought the threat of a public hearing would break my resolve. I did not write a long defense. I did not justify my actions or point out her horrific hypocrisy. I simply hit reply and typed a single short sentence. I will see you at the hearing. I hit send, turned off my phone, and went to sleep. Tomorrow they were going to learn that the daughter they spent 30 years underestimating was the one holding all the cards. The morning of the hearing arrived with a cold driving rain that seemed fitting for the occasion. I dressed in a sharp charcoal suit armor for the battle ahead. When I walked into the imposing marble foyer of the county probate courthouse, Mr. Davies was already waiting. He held his pristine leather briefcase and offered me a single confident nod. We walked into courtroom B together. My parents and Brandon were already seated at the petitioner's table. Patricia wore a beige, conservative dress, clutching a tissue to project the image of a heartbroken mother. Richard sat rigidly beside his overpriced attorney, looking smug and expectant. Brandon sat behind them, staring at his phone, completely unaware that his entire house of cards was about to collapse. When they saw me walk in without a lawyer of my own, their eyes lit up with predatory triumph. They assumed Mr. Davies was just a trust administrator, and that I was completely unrepresented in the conservatorship matter. The judge, a stern woman named Honorable Abernathy, called the hearing to order. She peered over her glasses at the petition in front of her before addressing my father, attorney. Counsel, the judge began, her voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. You have filed an emergency petition for conservatorship, claiming your daughter is a danger to herself and her assets. This is a severe legal maneuver. I expect you have substantial proof to back up these claims of mental incompetence. Richard Attorney stood up, smoothing his tie. Yes, Your Honor. We have submitted affidavits from multiple family members detailing Miss Sterling's recent erratic and aggressive behavior. She has inexplicably seized control of her late grandmother estate, immediately initiating eviction proceedings against her own brother and his pregnant wife. Furthermore, she has a documented history of psychological instability, requiring professional intervention. We believe the sudden acquisition of significant wealth has triggered a severe manic episode, rendering her incapable of managing the Beatrice Sterling Heritage Trust. The attorney sat down looking incredibly pleased with himself. Patricia dabbed at her dry eyes with her tissue. Judge Abernathy turned her gaze to me. Miss Sterling, do you have legal representation today? Mr. Davies stood up before I could answer. I represent Miss Sterling and the Beatrice Sterling Heritage Trust, Your Honor. We have filed a motion to dismiss this petition with prejudice, accompanied by a comprehensive evidentiary packet that completely refutes every claim made by the petitioners. He approached the bench and handed the bailiff a thick binder. The bailiff passed it to the judge. First, Mr. Davies continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority. We have submitted sworn statements from Dr. Eris Thorne and Dr. Evelyn Vance, the late Beatrice Sterling primary physicians. They categorically confirm that Mrs. Sterling was of completely sound mind and under no duress when she established the trust and named my client as the sole beneficiary and trustee. There was no manipulation. It was a calculated legal decision made by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Richard's jaw tightened. His attorney quickly stood up. Your Honor, medical records of the deceased do not disprove my client daughter's current mental instability. Mr. Davies smiled a cold, terrifying expression. I am getting to that, counselor. Your Honor, if you turn to tab 3, you will find the performance evaluations and sworn statements from the executive directors at my client financial firm. They confirm that Miss Sterling has been performing her duties flawlessly, including leading a multi-million-dollar corporate merger just yesterday. She is a highly competent financial analyst. The judge flipped through the binder, her eyebrows rising. This is very thorough, Mr. Davies. But what about the sudden eviction of her brother? The petitioners claim it was an act of manic cruelty. This is where we dismantle the narrative, Your Honor, Mr. Davies said, pacing slowly in front of our table. My client was not acting out of malice. She was protecting the trust assets from an individual with a severe, destructive financial addiction. If you look at tab 4, you will see the financial reality of the man the petitioners are trying to protect. Brandon's head snapped up from his phone. Patricia's face went completely white. We have submitted banking records proving that Brandon Sterling has not had a legitimate income in 8 months, Mr. Davies announced, his voice booming through the courtroom. Instead, he has accumulated over $200,000 in illicit gambling debts and offshore casino losses. He currently has an active levy from the IRS for years of unpaid taxes. Objection! Richard attorney shouted, scrambling to his feet. This is irrelevant character assassination. It speaks directly to motive, Your Honor, Mr. Davies countered sharply. The petitioners are attempting to seize control of my client trust fund, not to protect her, but to bail out their son and save themselves. Tab 5 contains the loan documents showing that Richard and Patricia Sterling took out a massive second mortgage on their own home and drained their retirement accounts to secretly fund Brandon's gambling addiction. Their home is currently entering pre-foreclosure. They are entirely bankrupt. The courtroom descended into absolute chaos. Richard slammed his fist on the table, turning his furious glare on Brandon. Patricia began actually sobbing, her carefully constructed facade shattering into a million pieces. The judge banged her gavel hard, restoring order. Silence in my courtroom. Judge Abernathy commanded, her voice cutting through the noise like a whip. She glared down at Richard and his attorney. You brought an emergency petition before this court attempting to strip a competent woman of her legal rights under the guise of paternal concern. In reality, you are drowning in debt and attempting to use the court system to facilitate a financial theft. Your Honor, please, Richard stammered, standing up, his face red and sweating. The money is family money. She is hoarding it while her brother loses his business. He has a commercial lease he cannot pay. He is going to be sued. I stood up. It was my turn to deliver the final blow. That is exactly right, Dad, I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. Brandon is 6 months behind on the commercial lease for his office space. He has received multiple final notices and is facing an imminent lawsuit for breach of contract. Richard looked confused. Yes, he needs help, Claire. He is going to lose his office. He has already lost it, I stated firmly. The property management company initiating the lawsuit is Apex Commercial Properties LLC. Brandon's eyes widened in sheer panic. He knew the name of his landlord. For the record, Your Honor, I continued addressing the judge. Apex Commercial Properties is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Beatrice Sterling Heritage Trust. As the trustee, I am the owner of that building. I am the one evicting him, and I will be pursuing him for every single cent of back rent he owes the trust. The silence that followed was absolute. The color drained completely from Brandon's face. He slumped back in his chair, looking like he had been physically struck. Richard and Patricia stared at me, their mouths open, unable to comprehend the magnitude of their defeat. They had walked into the courtroom expecting an easy victory against the obedient daughter they had spent a lifetime pushing around. Instead, they found themselves completely outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and utterly destroyed. Judge Abernathy closed the binder with a heavy thud. She looked at my parents with absolute disgust. Petition dismissed with prejudice, she ruled, her gavel coming down with finality. And Mr. Sterling, consider yourself incredibly fortunate that I am not pursuing perjury charges against you today. If I ever see your names on my docket again, you will leave this courthouse in handcuffs. We are adjourned. I did not wait around to watch them process their ruin. I picked up my briefcase and walked out of the courtroom with Mr. Davies right beside me. As we stepped into the hallway, Patricia rushed out after us, her heels clicking frantically on the marble floor. Claire, wait, Patricia pleaded, reaching out to grab my arm. You cannot do this. We are your family. You are leaving us with nothing. We will be out on the street. I pulled my arm out of her grasp, looking at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small. You made your choices, Mom, I said, my voice lacking any trace of anger or sympathy. You chose to fund his gambling. You chose to ruin my credit years ago. You chose to file a fraudulent court petition to steal my inheritance and lock me in a conservatorship. Family does not do that. But what are we supposed to do? She cried, her hands trembling. I looked at her coldly. You had better start packing. I hear the rental market is tough this time of year. I turned my back on her and walked away, the sound of her sobs echoing in the vast, empty hallway. The rain outside had stopped and the morning sun was breaking through the clouds. I stepped out into the crisp air, feeling a profound sense of liberation. The invisible chains of guilt, obligation, and fear that had bound me to them for 30 years were completely severed. I had protected my grandmother's legacy, and in the process, I had finally claimed my own life. I took a deep breath of the fresh air, smiling as I walked toward my car. My coffee was not going to get cold today. I drove back to my house with a singular burning focus. The moment I locked the front door behind me, I spread the contents of my briefcase across the massive oak dining table. On the left, I placed the crumpled stack of final notices Jasmine had salvaged from Brandon's car. On the right, I opened the pristine leather binder Mr. Davies had handed me earlier that morning. I needed to verify what my gut was already screaming was true. I flipped past the residential holdings and the high-yield dividend portfolios, going straight to the commercial real estate annex. My grandmother had always been exceptionally private about her investments. She never discussed her portfolio at family dinners, preferring to let my father posture and brag about his regional management position, while she quietly amassed a fortune. Now, looking at the meticulous ledgers, I understood exactly why she kept her mouth shut. She owned dozens of commercial properties across the city, managed entirely through shell companies and blind trusts. I ran my finger down the alphabetical list of corporate entities. Page 4, paragraph 2. Apex Commercial Properties, LLC. My heart pounded a steady, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. I picked up the most recent final notice from Brandon's stack. The letterhead bore the exact same logo, a minimalist mountain peak. I compared the address of his so-called architectural consulting firm with the property registry in the trust binder. It was an exact match. Suite 400 in a highly desirable downtown high-rise. The lease agreement listed in the binder showed that the tenant had signed a 5-year contract at a premium monthly rate. The tenant on the ledger was listed as Brandon Sterling. A laugh punched its way out of my throat, sharp and entirely devoid of humor. For years, my parents had weaponized Brandon's downtown office as the ultimate proof of his superiority. They constantly reminded me how prestigious his address was, how successful he must be to afford such a prime location while I worked a standard corporate job. Patricia used to casually mention his corner office view at every social gathering. Yet the entire time the building he was renting from the very ground he was standing on belonged to the grandmother they constantly dismissed as a frail, out-of-touch old woman. And now it belonged to me. I sat down at the head of the table, the reality of the situation settling over me like a heavy protective mantle. I was not just the target of their desperate financial scam. I was the one holding the keys to the kingdom they were trying to steal. I began carefully cross-referencing the dates on the eviction notices with the financial ledgers Mr. Davies had provided. The timeline told a story of absolute reckless arrogance. Brandon had stopped paying his rent exactly 6 months ago. That lined up perfectly with the time my parents had secretly taken out the second mortgage on their house to bail him out of his initial gambling debts. He had clearly used their massive cash infusion to fund his worsening addiction rather than paying his overhead. He had let the rent slide, assuming my parents would simply write another check when the property management company finally cornered him. But the management company was a faceless corporate entity, acting on the strict legal directives of the trust. They did not care about the Sterling family name. They only cared about the bottom line. According to the documents, the management firm had sent 3 separate warnings, a formal notice of default, and finally the imminent lockout warning Jasmine had found hidden in his trunk. Brandon had ignored every single one of them. He had continued putting on his tailored suits, driving his leased luxury car, and pretending to be a master of the universe while his world burned down around him. He was playing a dangerous game of chicken with a landlord he assumed was just another corporate bureaucracy he could eventually manipulate or outrun. He had absolutely no idea that the landlord was his own flesh and blood. He had no idea that the very estate he was trying to steal through a fraudulent conservatorship petition was the only thing keeping a roof over his failing business. If he or my father had bothered to look past their own greed, they might have realized the trap they were walking into. But their arrogance was their defining blind spot. They viewed me as weak as a stepping stone, as an obedient safety net meant to catch them when they fell. They genuinely believed that forcing me into a conservatorship would give them the magic wand they needed to wave away their financial ruin. Instead, they had handed me the exact weapon I needed to dismantle their entire facade. By attempting to declare me mentally unfit to control my assets, they were forcing a legal spotlight directly onto the trust. And once that spotlight was turned on, it would expose every single one of Brandon's unpaid debts and my parents' complicit financial ruin. I traced the signature line on the master lease agreement. Brandon had signed his name with bold, sweeping strokes. He had committed himself to a legally binding contract with severe penalty clauses for default. The total amount owed, including late fees and legal penalties, was nearly $80,000. It was a sum he could not possibly pay, and a sum my parents no longer had the resources to cover. I opened my laptop and booted up my word processor. I did not need to wait for the property management company to execute the final lockout. As the sole trustee and legal owner of Apex Commercial Properties, I had the authority to issue a direct, immediate notice of termination and eviction. I typed out the formal legal document, citing the exact clauses of his breach of contract. I detailed the 6 months of unpaid rent, the accumulated penalties, and the immediate demand for the premises to be vacated. I printed the document, the printer whirring loudly in the quiet house. I signed my name at the bottom, pressing the pen firmly into the paper. But I did not fold it into an envelope. I did not walk out to the mailbox or call a courier. Instead, I slid the crisp white document into a clear plastic sleeve. I opened my leather briefcase, the same one I would be carrying into the probate courthouse for the conservatorship hearing, and tucked the eviction notice securely inside. I snapped the clasps shut, locking it away. I was not going to mail it to his empty office. I was going to hand it to him in person in front of a judge. Before I could face my parents in Judge Abernathy courtroom, I had one critical vulnerability left to neutralize. The emergency conservatorship petition Richard had filed included a standard preliminary freeze on my personal checking and savings profiles. It was a calculated legal maneuver designed to paralyze the subject, cutting off their resources so they could not hire independent counsel or flee. It also meant that my upcoming paycheck from my corporate job, along with my quarterly performance bonus, would drop directly into a frozen void. I was not about to let my father hold my hard-earned salary hostage while he attempted to steal my grandmother estate. Early that morning, long before the courthouse doors were scheduled to open, I drove to the main downtown branch of my bank. The city was still waking up, the streets slick with a cold morning mist, but my mind had never been clearer. The crushing anxiety that used to accompany any financial dealing with my family had entirely vanished. I walked through the heavy brass doors of the bank, stepping onto the polished marble floors with a singular objective. I bypassed the standard teller queue and walked directly to the glass-walled office of my personal banker. She looked up in surprise as I sat down, pulling a stack of heavily redacted trust documents from my briefcase. I explained the situation without an ounce of emotion. My personal accounts were temporarily inaccessible due to pending litigation, but I needed to establish an immediate secure routing protocol for all future incoming deposits. Because I was now the sole trustee of the Beatrice Sterling Heritage Trust, I had the legal authority to open a new operational account shielded entirely by the trust corporate tax identification number. It was a completely separate legal entity, untouchable by any personal conservatorship filings my father managed to invent. The banker reviewed the verified trust documents, her eyes widening slightly, as she absorbed the sheer financial weight of what I had inherited. She typed rapidly on her keyboard, navigating the complex administrative backend of the banking system. Within 20 minutes, the paperwork was generated and printed. I signed my name on the dotted lines, officially rerouting my direct deposits and completely walling off my only remaining financial exposure. The feeling of vulnerability that had plagued me my entire adult life was completely gone. I was wearing an impenetrable suit of armor forged from my grandmother Foresight and my own newfound resolve. I thanked the banker, gathered my documents, and stood up to leave, feeling more prepared than ever for the legal battle ahead. As I pushed open the glass door of the office, a harsh, demanding voice echoed through the cavernous lobby. The sound made my spine instantly rigid. It was a voice I had been conditioned to fear and obey for 3 decades. I stepped out of the office and looked toward the main teller counter. Standing there, red-faced and sweating through his expensive dress shirt, was Richard. He was aggressively tapping his knuckles against the marble counter, leaning over the glass partition to intimidate the young woman behind the screen. He looked absolutely frantic, like a man watching his entire life burn to the ground. He needed cash to stop the impending foreclosure on his house, and he needed it today. "You are not listening to me," he barked, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "I am listed as a primary signatory on that account. I demand an immediate cashier check for $50,000. The teller looked terrified, but she was holding her ground, staring intently at her computer monitor. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but the system is explicitly rejecting the request. That profile is inactive." "Do not tell me it is inactive." Richard slammed his palm flat against the counter, causing several customers to jump. The security guard standing near the entrance took a slow, deliberate step toward the counter, resting his hand on his radio. "My daughter set up that joint account with me years ago. I am her father. I am in the middle of filing for a legal conservatorship due to her severe mental instability. I have every legal right to access those funds to cover her impending medical and legal expenses. Do your job and cut the check before I call your branch manager." The sheer audacity of his lie made my blood run cold. He was standing in a public bank weaponizing my supposed mental health crisis to steal money to cover Brandon gambling debts. I did not shrink away. I did not avert my eyes and look for the nearest exit. I walked purposefully across the lobby, my heels clicking loudly and rhythmically against the marble. I stopped right behind him, crossing my arms over my chest. "Are you having trouble making a withdrawal?" "Dad?" I asked, my tone conversational, but carrying enough volume to turn every head in the room. Richard whipped around. The color drained from his face for a fraction of a second before his features twisted into a familiar, furious glare. He immediately tried to seize control of the narrative, taking a step toward me and projecting his voice so the growing audience could hear him. "Claire, what on earth are you doing here?" he demanded, adopting a sickening tone of exaggerated paternal concern. "You should be resting at home. We are all deeply worried about your current state of mind. You have not been acting like yourself lately. I am just trying to secure your assets before you do something destructive that you will regret." He expected me to cower. He expected the public attention to shame me into submission just as it always had. Instead, I stepped closer, invading his personal space and refusing to break eye contact. I looked past his sweating face and addressed the nervous teller directly. "Could you please remind my father when that specific joint account was officially closed?" I asked her, keeping my voice perfectly calm and polite. The teller swallowed hard, glancing nervously between us before looking back at her screen. "The account was permanently closed 3 years ago, Mom," she answered quietly. I turned my attention back to Richard, whose face had suddenly frozen in a mask of absolute horror. "That account was closed 3 years ago. Dad," I repeated loudly, ensuring the security guard and the surrounding customers heard every single word. "Right after you used your joint access to quietly drain $20,000 of my hard-earned savings to pay for Brandon lavish wedding catering. You wiped out my entire emergency fund without asking, and then told me I was being selfish and difficult when I cried about it. I closed that account the very next morning. So good luck finding anything left to steal today." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson as the surrounding customers began to whisper, staring at him with undisguised disgust. He realized in real time that his public performance had backfired completely. His patriarchal facade was shattered, exposing the desperate thief underneath. I adjusted the strap of my briefcase on my shoulder. "I will see you in court," I said, dropping my voice to a cold, hard whisper meant only for him. I turned on my heel and walked straight out the heavy brass doors of the bank, leaving him standing there fuming, humiliated, and entirely empty-handed. The morning of the hearing arrived with a cold, driving rain that seemed fitting for the occasion. I dressed in a sharp charcoal suit armor for the battle ahead. When I walked into the imposing marble foyer of the county probate courthouse, Mr. Davies was already waiting. He held his pristine leather briefcase and offered me a single, confident nod. We walked into courtroom B together. My parents and Brandon were already seated at the petitioner's table. Patricia wore a beige conservative dress, clutching a tissue to project the image of a heartbroken mother. Richard sat rigidly beside his overpriced attorney, looking smug and expectant. Brandon sat behind them, staring at his phone, completely unaware that his entire house of cards was about to collapse. When they saw me walk in without a lawyer of my own, their eyes lit up with predatory triumph. They assumed Mr. Davies was just a trust administrator, and that I was completely unrepresented in the conservatorship matter. The judge, a stern woman named Honorable Abernathy, called the hearing to order. She peered over her glasses at the petition in front of her before addressing my father, attorney. "Counsel," the judge began, her voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. "You have filed an emergency petition for conservatorship, claiming your daughter is a danger to herself and her assets. This is a severe legal maneuver. I expect you have substantial proof to back up these claims of mental incompetence." Richard, attorney, stood up, smoothing his tie. "Yes, Your Honor. We have submitted affidavits from multiple family members detailing Miss Sterling's recent erratic and aggressive behavior. She has inexplicably seized control of her late grandmother estate, immediately initiating eviction proceedings against her own brother and his pregnant wife. Furthermore, she has a documented history of psychological instability requiring professional intervention. We believe the sudden acquisition of significant wealth has triggered a severe manic episode, rendering her incapable of managing the Beatrice Sterling Heritage Trust. The attorney sat down, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Patricia dabbed at her dry eyes with her tissue. Judge Abernathy turned her gaze to me. Miss Sterling, do you have legal representation today? Mr. Davies stood up before I could answer. I represent Miss Sterling and the Beatrice Sterling Heritage Trust, Your Honor. We have filed a motion to dismiss this petition with prejudice, accompanied by a comprehensive evidentiary packet that completely refutes every claim made by the petitioners. He approached the bench and handed the bailiff a thick binder. The bailiff passed it to the judge. First, Mr. Davies continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority. We have submitted sworn statements from Dr. Eris Thorne and Dr. Evelyn Vance, the late Beatrice Sterling primary physicians. They categorically confirm that Mrs. Sterling was of completely sound mind and under no duress when she established the trust, and named my client as the sole beneficiary and trustee. There was no manipulation. It was a calculated legal decision made by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Richard's jaw tightened. His attorney quickly stood up. Your Honor, medical records of the deceased do not disprove my client daughter's current mental instability. Mr. Davies smiled a cold, terrifying expression. I am getting to that, counselor. Your Honor. If you turn to tab 3, you will find the performance evaluations and sworn statements from the executive directors at my client financial firm. They confirm that Miss Sterling has been performing her duties flawlessly, including leading a multi-million-dollar corporate merger just yesterday. She is a highly competent financial analyst. The judge flipped through the binder, her eyebrows rising. This is very thorough, Mr. Davies. But what about the sudden eviction of her brother? The petitioners claim it was an act of manic cruelty. This is where we dismantle the narrative, Your Honor, Mr. Davies said, pacing slowly in front of our table. My client was not acting out of malice. She was protecting the trust assets from an individual with a severe destructive financial addiction. If you look at tab 4, you will see the financial reality of the man the petitioners are trying to protect. Brandon's head snapped up from his phone. Patricia's face went completely white. We have submitted banking records proving that Brandon Sterling has not had a legitimate income in 8 months, Mr. Davies announced, his voice booming through the courtroom. Instead, he has accumulated over $200,000 in illicit gambling debts and offshore casino losses. He currently has an active levy from the IRS for years of unpaid taxes. Objection! Richard Attorney shouted, scrambling to his feet. This is irrelevant character assassination. It speaks directly to motive, Your Honor, Mr. Davies countered sharply. The petitioners are attempting to seize control of my client trust fund, not to protect her, but to bail out their son and save themselves. Tab 5 contains the loan documents showing that Richard and Patricia Sterling took out a massive second mortgage on their own home and drained their retirement accounts to secretly fund Brandon's gambling addiction. Their home is currently entering pre-foreclosure. They are entirely bankrupt. The courtroom descended into absolute chaos. Richard slammed his fist on the table, turning his furious glare on Brandon. Patricia began actually sobbing, her carefully constructed facade shattering into a million pieces. The judge banged her gavel hard, restoring order. Silence in my courtroom, Judge Abernathy commanded, her voice cutting through the noise like a whip. She glared down at Richard and his attorney. You brought an emergency petition before this court attempting to strip a competent woman of her legal rights under the guise of paternal concern. In reality, you are drowning in debt and attempting to use the court system to facilitate a financial theft. Your Honor, please, Richard stammered, standing up, his face red and sweating. The money is family money. She is hoarding it while her brother loses his business. He has a commercial lease he cannot pay. He is going to be sued. I stood up. It was my turn to deliver the final blow. That is exactly right, Dad, I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. Brandon is 6 months behind on the commercial lease for his office space. He has received multiple final notices and is facing an imminent lawsuit for breach of contract. Richard looked confused. Yes. He needs help, Claire. He is going to lose his office. He has already lost it, I stated firmly. The property management company initiating the lawsuit is Apex Commercial Properties, LLC. Brandon's eyes widened in sheer panic. He knew the name of his landlord. For the record, Your Honor, I continued addressing the judge. Apex Commercial Properties is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Beatrice Sterling Heritage Trust. As the trustee, I am the owner of that building. I am the one evicting him, and I will be pursuing him for every single cent of back rent he owes the trust. The silence that followed was absolute. The color drained completely from Brandon's face. He slumped back in his chair looking like he had been physically struck. Richard and Patricia stared at me, their mouths open, unable to comprehend the magnitude of their defeat. They had walked into the courtroom expecting an easy victory against the obedient daughter they had spent a lifetime pushing around. Instead, they found themselves completely outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and utterly destroyed. Judge Abernathy closed the binder with a heavy thud. She looked at my parents with absolute disgust. Petition dismissed with prejudice, she ruled, her gavel coming down with finality. And Mr. Sterling, consider yourself incredibly fortunate that I am not pursuing perjury charges against you today. If I ever see your names on my docket again, you will leave this courthouse in handcuffs. We are adjourned. I did not wait around to watch them process their ruin. I picked up my briefcase and walked out of the courtroom with Mr. Davies right beside me. As we stepped into the hallway, Patricia rushed out after us, her heels clicking frantically on the marble floor. "Claire, wait!" Patricia pleaded, reaching out to grab my arm. "You cannot do this. We are your family. You are leaving us with nothing. We will be out on the street." I pulled my arm out of her grasp, looking at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small. "You made your choices, Mom," I said, my voice lacking any trace of anger or sympathy. "You chose to fund his gambling. You chose to ruin my credit years ago. You chose to file a fraudulent court petition to steal my inheritance and lock me in a conservatorship. Family does not do that." "But what are we supposed to do?" she cried, her hands trembling. I looked at her coldly. "You had better start packing. I hear the rental market is tough this time of year." I turned my back on her and walked away, the sound of her sobs echoing in the vast empty hallway. The rain outside had stopped and the morning sun was breaking through the clouds. I stepped out into the crisp air, feeling a profound sense of liberation. The invisible chains of guilt, obligation, and fear that had bound me to them for 30 years were completely severed. I had protected my grandmother's legacy, and in the process, I had finally claimed my own life. I took a deep breath of the fresh air, smiling as I walked toward my car. My coffee was not going to get cold today. The morning of the conservatorship hearing arrived with a cold, driving rain that lashed against the windshield of my car. The bleak weather perfectly matched the imposing architecture of the downtown probate courthouse. I walked through the heavy revolving doors, letting the storm slip away behind me as I entered the cavernous marble foyer. The building was designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant with its towering stone columns and echoing hallways, but I felt nothing but a cold, sharp sense of purpose. Mr. Davies was already waiting for me near the security checkpoint. He looked immaculate in a dark, tailored suit, holding his pristine leather briefcase like a loaded weapon. We rode the elevator up to the 4th floor in comfortable silence. When we pushed open the heavy wooden double doors to Courtroom D, the atmosphere instantly shifted into high tension. My parents and Brandon were already seated at the petitioner's table. They had clearly spent the entire morning meticulously curating their appearance for maximum sympathetic impact. Patricia wore a subdued, high-necked navy dress, her hair pulled back, simply clutching a delicate lace handkerchief in her hands. She looked the perfect picture of a grieving, exhausted mother forced into a heartbreaking situation. Richard sat rigidly beside his expensive attorney, wearing a conservative gray suit, projecting the image of a stoic, burdened patriarch, trying to do the right thing for his troubled family. Brandon sat directly behind them, wearing a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car. He leaned back in the wooden gallery chair with a posture of unearned confidence, checking a heavy gold watch and whispering something to Patricia. He was completely oblivious to the trap waiting for him. But my eyes immediately found Jasmine. She sat at the far end of the gallery bench looking pale and incredibly tense. She wore a simple black sweater and kept her gaze fixed firmly on the scuffed wooden floorboards, avoiding eye contact with my parents, with Brandon, and especially with me. She was playing her part perfectly, maintaining her cover as the submissive wife, while silently waiting for the explosion she knew was coming. I took my seat next to Mr. Davies, keeping my expression entirely neutral, as the bailiff announced the arrival of Judge Abernathy. The judge, a formidable woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, took her seat at the elevated bench and called the docket. Richard Attorney, a slick, polished man named Harrison, stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. He walked toward the center of the courtroom with a practiced expression of deep solemnity. "Your Honor, we are here today regarding a family tragedy." Harrison began, his voice carrying a perfect blend of professional distance and manufactured sympathy. "We have filed an emergency petition for temporary and permanent conservatorship over the person and estate of Claire Sterling. This is not an action my clients take lightly. They are loving parents who have watched their daughter spiral into a severe mental health crisis, exacerbated by a sudden and deeply confusing inheritance." Harrison paced slowly in front of our table, making sure the judge tracked his every movement. "My client mother, the late Beatrice Sterling, passed away recently. In her final days, while her physical and mental health were rapidly declining, she executed a new trust document, leaving her entire substantial estate solely to her granddaughter Claire. We have grave concerns about the undue influence and manipulation surrounding that document, but that is a matter for another venue. Today, our immediate concern is Claire's immediate safety and the protection of those trust assets from her current manic episode." He paused, letting the silence stretch for dramatic effect. Patricia dabbed perfectly at her dry eyes with her lace handkerchief. Richard placed a comforting hand over hers, playing the supportive husband. "Since gaining control of this wealth, Miss Sterling has exhibited highly erratic, aggressive, and destructive behavior." Harrison continued, raising his voice slightly to fill the large room. "She has lashed out at her family, initiating hostile financial actions against her own parents and her brother. She has publicly accosted her father, screaming paranoid delusions in a crowded bank lobby. She is acting out of a severe psychological break, convinced her family is trying to harm her. But, Your Honor, the most critical piece of evidence regarding her total unfitness to manage this estate lies in her documented financial history." Harrison returned to his table and picked up a thick manila folder, holding it up for the judge to see. "We have submitted a comprehensive review of Miss Sterling's financial records from her early 20s. They show a young woman completely incapable of managing even basic personal finances, let alone a complex corporate trust. By the time she was 23, she had amassed over $50,000 in consumer debt. She had multiple credit cards in default, severely delinquent accounts, and a credit score in the low 400s. She was pursued relentlessly by debt collectors and faced total financial ruin due to her impulsive, reckless spending." My blood boiled listening to the sheer audacity of the lie, but I kept my face perfectly still, staring straight ahead. He was reading the history of the credit cards my parents had fraudulently opened in my name to pay for Brandon college expenses, his luxury vacations, and his mounting gambling debts. They had ruined my financial standing, trapped me in years of credit repair, and were now trying to use that exact financial abuse as proof of my incompetence in a court of law. Her parents had to step in and slowly help her rebuild her life, Harrison said, his voice softening into a tone of paternal pity. They paid off her debts and tried to teach her responsibility. Now she has been handed the keys to a massive financial empire. The sudden wealth has triggered a severe relapse of her worst impulsive behaviors. She is a danger to the estate, and more importantly, a danger to herself. We are simply asking the court to grant Richard Sterling temporary conservatorship to secure the assets, prevent further reckless depletion of the trust, and ensure his daughter receives the psychological help she desperately needs." As Harrison finished his opening statement and returned to his seat, Patricia let out a quiet, perfectly timed sob, burying her face in her hands. Brandon placed a comforting hand on his mother's shoulder, looking at me with an expression of smug pity. They had painted their masterpiece. They had portrayed me as a greedy, unstable villain who had stolen from a dying grandmother and could not even manage a basic checking account without parental supervision. They sat back in their chairs, radiating a sickening confidence, completely convinced they had already won. The courtroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The air was thick with the weight of the accusations. The only sound was the steady drumming of the rain against the high, arched windows. Several clerks and assistants in the room were looking at me with undisguised judgment, fully buying into the tragic narrative of the struggling parents trying to save their unhinged daughter from herself. Judge Abernathy folded her hands on the heavy wooden bench. She looked down at the petition file in front of her, her expression entirely unreadable. She took her time reviewing the summary notes, allowing the tension in the room to stretch until it was almost physically painful. My parents sat up a little straighter, anticipating the immediate granting of their emergency request. They were so confident in their absolute control over the narrative that they had not even considered the possibility of a rigorous defense. They thought Mr. Davies was just a corporate suit there to hand over the keys to the kingdom. Finally, Judge Abernathy slowly raised her head and peered over the rim of her reading glasses. Her sharp gaze bypassed Richard and his attorney entirely and landed squarely on our table. The heavy silence stretched for another agonizing second before she spoke. She turned her attention directly to Mr. Davies, her voice echoing with absolute judicial authority. "Counsel, how does your client respond to these allegations of financial instability?" Mr. Davies stood. He did not rush. He calmly adjusted his cuffs, picked up a thick leather-bound portfolio from our table, and stepped toward the center podium. He projected an aura of absolute terrifying calm, contrasting sharply with the theatrical emotion radiating from my parents. "Your Honor, my client responds to these allegations by presenting the court with the actual documented truth." Mr. Davies began, his voice resonant and steady. "A truth that the petitioners have actively attempted to conceal through perjury and deliberate omission." He opened his portfolio, withdrawing a stack of neatly tabbed documents. "Let us first address the character assassination regarding Miss Sterling and her financial history. Opposing counsel paints a picture of a reckless young woman who drowned in consumer debt during her 20s. What they conveniently failed to disclose is that those credit accounts were fraudulently opened by Richard and Patricia Sterling using their daughter's social security number while she was away at college." A sharp gasp echoed from the gallery. Judge Abernathy's eyes narrowed, her gaze darting instantly to Richard, whose stoic posture suddenly turned rigid. "If you turn to tab A, Your Honor, you will see the transaction histories for those defaulted accounts." Mr. Davies continued, handing a duplicate binder to the bailiff, who passed it up to the bench. "You will note that the charges do not reflect the lifestyle of a struggling college student. They reflect luxury car payments, offshore sports betting deposits, and high-end men apparel. The debt that ruined my client credit score was accumulated entirely by her brother Brandon Sterling and facilitated by her parents. My client spent 5 years living in a tiny apartment working 60-hour weeks to pay off debts she never incurred, simply to avoid sending her parents to federal prison for identity theft." "Harrison!" My father attorney leaned over and furiously whispered something to Richard. Richard shook his head rapidly, his face flushing a deep, guilty crimson. Mr. Davies did not give them a moment to recover. Furthermore, the claim that Miss Sterling is incapable of managing substantial wealth is frankly insulting. Tab B contains my client's complete employment record from one of the most prestigious corporate logistics firms in the city. Included are performance evaluations, commendations from her executive board, and proof that she personally oversees a corporate budget exceeding $40 million annually. She is not a fragile, unstable child. She is a highly respected financial director. Judge Abernathy flipped through the pages, her expression darkening with every piece of evidence she absorbed. "And finally, regarding the mental state of the late Beatrice Sterling," Mr. Davies said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Opposing counsel suggests the deceased was manipulated into leaving her estate to my client. Tab C contains sworn affidavits from Mrs. Sterling, primary care physician, her neurologist, and her personal legal team. They categorically confirm that Beatrice Sterling was of entirely sound mind until her final hours." She executed her new trust documents with absolute clarity. She bypassed her son Richard Sterling not because of undue influence, but because she was fully aware of his disastrous financial reality. She knew that if he gained control of her estate, he would destroy it. Mr. Davies closed the first section of his portfolio and took a slow, deliberate step toward the petitioner's table. The atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted. The sympathetic narrative my parents had carefully constructed was cracking the ugly truth bleeding through the fissures. Patricia had stopped dabbing her eyes. The lace handkerchief was now tightly balled in her fists, her knuckles white. This brings us to the true motive behind this emergency petition, Mr. Davies announced, shifting his focus from my defense to an all-out offensive assault. The petitioners claim they are acting out of protective parental love. This is a complete fabrication. They are acting out of absolute financial desperation. They are using this court as a weapon to execute a hostile takeover of a trust they desperately need to survive. Judge Abernathy leaned forward, her hands clasped together. Explain, counselor. Mr. Davies pulled a second thinner binder from his briefcase. Your Honor, the petitioners are currently standing on the absolute brink of bankruptcy. Over the past 4 years, Richard and Patricia Sterling have systematically liquidated their entire net worth to fund the unsustainable lifestyle and worsening addictions of their son, Brandon. Brandon's head snapped up, his jaw dropping open. He looked at his parents, but they were staring straight ahead, completely paralyzed by the exposure of their darkest secrets. If you turn to the first exhibit in this binder, you will find property records indicating that Richard and Patricia Sterling secretly took out a massive second mortgage on their primary residence 18 months ago, Mr. Davies explained, tracing a line on his own copy of the document. That cash infusion was entirely transferred to an LLC owned by Brandon Sterling. Just 6 months later, they completely drained both of their retirement accounts, taking severe early withdrawal penalties. Again, the money was routed directly to Brandon. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. I watched Harrison, their attorney, turning pages frantically. It was abundantly clear he had known nothing about this. My parents had lied to their own legal counsel, feeding him a story of a manic daughter while hiding their own catastrophic ruin. Tab 3 shows the current state of the petitioner's finances. Mr. Davies continued, his tone clinical and unyielding. The second mortgage is currently 90 days past due. Their home is in the early stages of foreclosure. They have virtually zero liquidity. They are drowning in debt entirely caused by their relentless need to bail out a son who refuses to maintain legitimate employment. Mr. Davies turned slowly, fixing his gaze on Brandon. Speaking of Brandon Sterling, opposing counsel claims my client acted with manic cruelty by initiating eviction proceedings against her brother. What they omitted is that Brandon Sterling has been operating a fraudulent architectural consulting firm out of a premium downtown office suite owned by the Beatrice Sterling Heritage Trust. Brandon's face went completely white. The color drained from his skin so fast he looked as though he might physically be sick. He had no idea his landlord was the trust. He had no idea I held the deed to the very ground he stood on. He signed a binding 5-year lease agreement, Mr. Davies stated, his voice echoing off the marble walls, and he has not paid a single cent of rent in exactly 6 months. He has ignored multiple default notices, final warnings, and imminent lockout directives from the property management company. My client simply executed her fiduciary duty as trustee to remove a delinquent, non-paying tenant who owes the estate nearly $80,000 in back rent and penalties. The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. My parents had painted a picture of me as a crazy, vindictive monster attacking an innocent brother. Mr. Davies had just systematically proven that I was a competent, rational property owner, evicting a deadbeat tenant who happened to share my last name. Your Honor, Mr. Davies concluded, returning to the podium. This emergency petition is not a rescue mission. It is a desperate, malicious cash grab. Richard and Patricia Sterling realized they had completely exhausted their own resources. When they discovered that Claire Sterling had been given the keys to a multi-million-dollar estate, they saw a lifeline. They colluded to declare their perfectly sane daughter mentally incompetent, aiming to seize control of the trust so they could continue funding their son gambling debts and save their own home from the bank. We respectfully request that this court dismiss this petition immediately with extreme prejudice and order the petitioners to pay all associated legal fees for this frivolous and abusive filing. Judge Abernathy removed her reading glasses, her eyes blazing with undisguised fury as she glared down at Richard and Patricia. The manufactured sympathy they had walked in with was entirely gone, replaced by the ugly, naked reality of their greed. "This is a lie. My business is thriving." Brandon suddenly leapt to his feet. His face flushed a furious mottled red. He pointed a shaking finger at Mr. Davies, completely losing his temper in the middle of a federal courtroom. "You are making all of this up. I have clients. I have contracts. You cannot do this to me." "Mr. Sterling, sit down immediately and remain silent." Judge Abernathy snapped, slamming her gavel down with a sharp cracking sound that made Jasmine flinch in the gallery. "If you speak out of turn in my courtroom again, I will have the bailiff place you in handcuffs and hold you in contempt. Do you understand me?" Brandon swallowed hard, his bravado vanishing under the full weight of judicial authority. He slowly sank back into his chair, looking around frantically, realizing that his tailored suit and expensive watch could not shield him from the truth. The judge turned her piercing gaze away from my ruined family and looked directly at me. Her expression softened just a fraction, acknowledging the sheer weight of what I had been forced to endure. "Counsel," she said, addressing Mr. Davies, "I have heard your arguments, and the documentation you have provided is highly compelling. However, given the severe nature of the initial allegations, I would like to hear from the subject of the petition herself." Mr. Davies nodded respectfully and gestured toward the witness stand. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit. I walked past the table where my parents sat, completely frozen in their humiliation. I stepped up to the wooden enclosure, placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the absolute truth, and took my seat on the stand. I took my seat on the stand. The wooden chair felt solid beneath me, grounding me in the reality of the moment. Judge Abernathy leaned forward, resting her forearms on the heavy mahogany bench. She instructed me to state my full name for the record, and then asked me to explain the financial history my counsel had just presented. I took a slow, deliberate breath. The microphone amplified my voice, ensuring every syllable reached the farthest corners of the courtroom. I began with the day I graduated from college. I described the excitement of receiving my degree, being instantly crushed by the discovery of $50,000 in credit card debt attached to my Social Security number. I explained how I confronted my parents, terrified that my identity had been stolen by a stranger. I recounted the exact look on my father's face when he admitted he had opened the accounts. He did not apologize. He justified it. He told me that Brandon needed capital for a new business venture, and that as a family, we all had to make sacrifices. My sacrifice was my financial independence. I detailed the years of working 60-hour weeks at a grueling corporate job, living in a cramped apartment, and eating cheap meals just to make the minimum payments on debt I never authorized. I told the court about the $20,000 that vanished from a joint savings account I had foolishly maintained with my father. That money was my emergency fund, painstakingly built over years of frugality. Richard transferred it completely without my knowledge to cover the catering and floral arrangements for Brandon's lavish wedding. When I wept over the theft, Patricia called me selfish. She told me I was trying to ruin my brother's special day with my dramatic outbursts. I looked directly at my parents as I spoke. They sat rigidly at their table, unable to meet my gaze. The entire courtroom was dead silent, hanging on every word of my testimony. I explained that whenever I tried to establish basic financial boundaries, they accused me of being mentally unstable. They weaponized my perfectly normal reactions to their abuse, painting me as hysterical and irrational. I then shifted my testimony to my grandmother. Beatrice Sterling was a brilliant, observant woman who saw through their entire facade. I described the quiet afternoons I spent with her discussing corporate logistics and real estate investments, while my family ignored us. She knew exactly how Richard and Patricia operated. She knew they were draining their own assets to fund Brandon's reckless lifestyle, and she knew they had stolen from me to do it. That is why she bypassed her son entirely. She told me before she died that handing her estate to Richard would be like handing a match to an arsonist. She appointed me as the sole trustee because I was the only person in the family who knew how to protect a dollar rather than burn it. Judge Abernathy took meticulous notes, her pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. She looked up and adjusted her glasses. "Miss Sterling," she said, her voice sharp and inquiring. "Your brother had an outburst moments ago claiming his business is highly successful. Yet your counsel states you are evicting him for non-payment. Can you clarify this discrepancy?" I turned my head and locked eyes with Brandon. He was sitting perfectly still, his face slick with a nervous sweat. His custom suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. I addressed the court, but my gaze never left my brother. "Brandon claims his architectural consulting firm is thriving," I said, my voice projecting a cold, unwavering authority. "If his business is as successful as he loudly proclaimed, he should have absolutely no trouble explaining why he has defaulted entirely on his commercial lease." I reached down and unclasped my pristine leather briefcase, pulling out the clear plastic sleeve I had prepared earlier that morning. I removed the crisp white document and handed it to the bailiff. I asked that it be entered into evidence and passed to opposing counsel. The bailiff walked the document over to Harrison, who took one look at the letterhead and visibly paled. He slid it across the table toward Richard and Brandon. "For the past 6 months, Brandon has not made a single rent payment on Suite 400. I continued outlining the exact figures. He has accumulated massive late fees, ignored 3 separate default notices, and disregarded an imminent lockout warning. He assumed he could play a game of chicken with a faceless corporate entity. He believed he could outrun Apex Commercial Properties by hiding behind his expensive lawyers and our parents' dwindling bank accounts. What he failed to realize is the true nature of his landlord." I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. Brandon stared at the document on the table, his eyes wide, with a dawning, horrifying realization. The paper in front of him bore the unmistakable signature of his own sister, authorizing the immediate seizure of his office space. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He was entirely trapped. "Apex Commercial Properties is not a faceless bureaucracy," I stated firmly, ensuring the judge heard every single word. "It is a shell company created by Beatrice Sterling. It is wholly owned by the Heritage Trust." "You say your business is thriving, Brandon. Then why have you not paid rent in 6 months?" He gripped the edge of the plaintiff table, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked desperately toward his father, but Richard was staring at the floor, completely broken by the revelation of his own impending bankruptcy. "The worthless building you operate out of belongs to the trust," I said, delivering the final devastating blow. "I am your landlord. Consider this your formal notice of eviction." Brandon's face drained of all remaining color, transforming into a sickly, chalky white. He slumped backward against his chair, staring at me in absolute shock. The reality of his complete ruin had finally pierced his arrogant armor. He had no office, he had no business, he had no money. The empire he had pretended to rule was nothing but a fragile illusion built on stolen funds and unpaid invoices. His entire identity as the successful golden child was entirely dismantled in front of a federal judge. Suddenly, Patricia leaped to her feet, knocking her heavy wooden chair backward with a loud clatter. "This is a fake," she started screaming, her voice echoing shrilly off the marble walls. "She is a pathological liar. She fabricated these documents to destroy my son. She is crazy. You have to lock her up." The courtroom descended into absolute chaos. Harrison grabbed Patricia's arm, desperately trying to pull her back into her seat while she thrashed and pointed at me. Richard was shouting at his lawyer, demanding he do something to stop the proceedings. Judge Abernathy slammed her gavel repeatedly, the sharp cracks cutting through the deafening noise. "Order in this court," the judge bellowed, demanding immediate silence. In the midst of the frantic screaming and the banging gavel, a single deliberate movement caught my eye. Jasmine, who had been sitting frozen in the gallery for the entire hearing, slowly stood up. She did not look at her husband. She did not look at her hysterical mother-in-law. She stepped out of the wooden pew, clutching her handbag tightly to her chest, and looked directly at the judge. Jasmine stood like a statue amidst the swirling chaos of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors of the gallery seemed to frame her trembling silhouette. She took a deep breath, her knuckles white around the strap of her leather handbag, and locked eyes with Judge Abernathy. The sheer intensity of her gaze made the judge pause with her gavel raised midair, the sharp crack of the wood echoing one final time before an eerie, absolute silence fell over the room. Even Patricia stopped her hysterical sobbing, turning to stare at her daughter-in-law with wide, panicked eyes. "Your Honor." Jasmine began, her voice shaking so violently it barely carried past the wooden partition. "I have something to say. I need to tell the truth." Brandon whipped around in his chair, his face contorting from shock into sheer panic. "Jasmine, sit down," he hissed loudly, lunging forward as if to grab her arm. "Do not say another word. You do not know what you are talking about." But Jasmine did not flinch. She stepped out of his reach, moving closer to the low wooden gate that separated the gallery from the courtroom floor. She ignored her husband completely, keeping her focus entirely on the judge. "Everything Claire just said is true," Jasmine stated, her voice gaining a desperate kind of strength. "It is all true, every single word." Patricia gasped, pressing her hands to her mouth. Richard sank lower into his chair, his face graying with impending doom. "I did not want to believe it," Jasmine continued, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and cutting tracks through her makeup. "I spent the last 2 years thinking Brandon was just stressed about the firm. He told me the market was tough. He told me clients were delaying payments. But the late notices kept arriving at the house. He hid the mail from me. He took out credit cards in my name without asking. 3 days ago, I found a stack of final collection warnings shoved in the spare tire compartment of his car." "Jasmine, please!" Brandon begged, his voice cracking. He stood up, holding his hands out in a placating gesture. "I was going to fix it. I was going to get the money today. Dad promised we would get the money today." "By locking your sister in a mental institution," Jasmine fired back, her voice suddenly turning to ice. "By stealing from the only person in this family who actually worked for what she had. You promised me you stopped gambling, Brandon. You promised me on our wedding day. But you lied. You drained our joint savings account. You maxed out the credit cards. And when you ran out of our money, you went to your parents and bled them dry, too." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick stack of crumpled envelopes, dropping them over the wooden partition. They hit the courtroom floor with a soft, damning thud. "Those are the foreclosure notices for his parents' house," she told the judge. "I found them in his briefcase this morning. They mortgaged their entire future to cover his casino debts and his offshore betting accounts. They lied to me. They lied to Claire. And they are lying to you right now." Brandon buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, defeated groan. The carefully constructed facade of the successful golden child was entirely obliterated, leaving nothing but a desperate thief, exposed in the harsh fluorescent lighting of a federal courtroom. "I cannot do this anymore," Jasmine said, looking down at Brandon with an expression of absolute profound disgust. "I refuse to raise our child in a house built on lies and stolen money. I refuse to be part of a family that would destroy their own daughter just to cover up a gambling addiction. I am done, Brandon. I am filing for divorce this afternoon, and I am taking full custody." Jasmine turned on her heel and walked straight out of the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors swinging shut behind her with a resounding thud. The echo of her departure hung in the air, a final, undeniable confirmation of everything Mr. Davies and I had presented. Judge Abernathy sat perfectly still behind the elevated bench. Her expression had transformed from judicial neutrality into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. She looked down at Richard and Patricia, who were now clinging to each other in a pathetic display of genuine terror. Their attorney Harrison had physically distanced himself from them, sliding his chair several inches away, as if their corruption was contagious. He was furiously packing his legal pads into his briefcase, clearly preparing to sever ties the moment the hearing concluded. Judge Abernathy picked up her gavel and brought it down with a single deafening crack. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling." The judge began, her voice dangerously low and vibrating with contained fury. In my 20 years on the bench, I have seen families fight over money. I have seen greed tear siblings apart. But I have rarely witnessed such a calculated, malicious, and entirely fraudulent abuse of the legal system. She picked up the emergency petition they had filed and held it up between her thumb and forefinger as if it were coated in poison. You came into my courtroom under the guise of loving, concerned parents. She continued, her words slicing through the silent room like a scalpel. You filed sworn affidavits claiming your daughter was suffering from a severe psychiatric break. You attempted to strip a competent, successful young woman of her basic civil liberties. You tried to freeze her personal assets and seize control of a multi-million-dollar corporate trust. And you did all of this not to protect her, but to facilitate a financial theft to cover up your own catastrophic bankruptcy and your son's rampant gambling addiction. Richard opened his mouth to speak, his hands trembling on the table. Your Honor, please, we were just trying to save our home. We were desperate. Do not interrupt me, Mr. Sterling. Judge Abernathy snapped, shutting him down instantly. Your desperation does not grant you the right to weaponize the probate court against your own child. You committed perjury in your filings. You colluded to commit financial fraud. You attempted to use a conservatorship designed to protect the vulnerable as a tool for extortion. Your mother, Beatrice Sterling, clearly possessed more financial and moral clarity in her final days than you have demonstrated in your entire life. She knew exactly what you were doing, and she took the appropriate legal steps to ensure you could never touch her legacy. The judge dropped the petition back onto her desk and leaned forward, fixing her sharp gaze on my parents and my brother. I am throwing out this conservatorship petition with extreme prejudice, Judge Abernathy declared, her voice echoing with absolute finality. This case is dismissed. Furthermore, I am ordering the petitioners Richard and Patricia Sterling to pay all legal fees and court costs incurred by the defense. She paused, letting the financial penalty sink into their already ruined ledgers before delivering her final warning. And you should consider yourselves incredibly fortunate that I am merely dismissing this case today. I am forwarding the transcripts of this hearing and the financial evidence provided by the defense directly to the District Attorney Office. They will be reviewing your sworn affidavits for perjury and investigating your financial maneuvers for potential fraud. If I ever see your names on my docket again, you will not be leaving this courthouse through the front doors. You will be leaving in handcuffs. We are adjourned, Judge Abernathy announced, striking her gavel one final time before standing and exiting the courtroom. The bailiff moved to the center of the room, signaling that the proceedings were officially over. I remained on the witness stand for a brief moment, letting the reality of the victory wash over me. The oppressive, suffocating weight I had carried on my shoulders for my entire life was completely gone. The invisible chains my parents had used to control and belittle me had been shattered in open court. They had tried to bury me, and instead they had handed me the shovel to dig their own graves. I stepped down from the stand, smoothing my jacket. Mr. Davies was waiting by our table, snapping his pristine leather briefcase shut. He offered me a rare, genuine smile, a silent acknowledgement of a flawless execution. We did not spare a single glance at the petitioner table. Richard was sitting with his head in his hands. Patricia was staring blankly at the wall, completely catatonic. Brandon was frantically scrolling through his phone, likely trying to figure out where he was going to sleep tonight, now that he had no office, no money, and no wife. They were broken. I was free. I picked up my bag and walked shoulder to shoulder with my attorney toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. The air felt lighter, easier to breathe. I pushed the doors open and stepped out into the wide marble hallway. The storm outside was still raging against the tall windows, but the real tempest was waiting for me right here. I stopped hearing the frantic clicking of heels echoing on the polished floor behind me. The final confrontation was here. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind us, sealing away the stifling atmosphere of Judge Abernathy's chamber. Out in the vast marble corridor, the air was significantly cooler. The storm outside had intensified, lashing rain against the towering arched windows that lined the courthouse walls. The rhythmic drumming of the water against the glass provided a stark contrast to the absolute silence between Mr. Davies and me. We walked a few paces away from the courtroom entrance, stopping near a wide stone pillar. He checked his phone while I simply stood there, letting the adrenaline slowly recede from my veins. The reality of the victory was settling in, replacing the years of manufactured anxiety with a profound sense of grounding. Before I could even formulate a thought to thank my attorney, the courtroom doors burst open with a violent shove. The loud thud echoed down the empty corridor. I turned to see my parents stumbling out into the hallway. Brandon was conspicuously absent, likely still cowering inside or searching for a back exit to avoid facing the reality of his shattered marriage and ruined finances. But Richard and Patricia were right there, and they looked entirely unrecognizable. The polished, authoritative veneer my father had worn like armor for my entire life was completely gone. His face was a mottled, furiously flushed shade of crimson. He stood frozen a few feet away from the doors, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. His hands opened and closed at his sides, as if grasping for invisible lifelines. He looked at me with a mixture of raw terror and suffocating rage, but he was completely speechless. The man who had spent 3 decades dictating my worth, issuing commands, and demanding absolute submission, could not find a single word to say. The magnitude of his impending criminal investigation and financial ruin had finally robbed him of his voice. Patricia, however, had entirely lost her grip on reality. Her subdued, grieving mother act had evaporated, leaving behind a frantic, desperate woman whose lifeline had just been severed. Her immaculate, high-necked navy dress looked rumpled. Her carefully pinned hair was fraying around her face, and mascara stained her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. She saw me standing by the pillar and immediately rushed forward. Her heels clicked erratically against the marble floor. Mr. Davies stepped forward smoothly, positioning himself slightly between us, a silent professional shield. But I raised my hand, signaling for him to hold his ground. I was not afraid of her anymore. I had nothing left to fear. Patricia stopped just short of reaching out to grab my arm. Her hands were trembling violently as she clutched her lace handkerchief, now twisted into a tight, damp knot. She looked at me with wide, frantic eyes, attempting to summon the maternal guilt that had worked so flawlessly in the past. "How could you destroy this family, Claire?" she gasped, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical wail. "Over money. You stood in there and humiliated your father. You destroyed your brother's marriage. You are going to let the bank take the house you grew up in." She let out a loud, racking sob, hoping to elicit sympathy. When my expression did not change, her tone shifted from grief to frantic bargaining. "You can fix this, Claire," she pleaded, stepping closer and lowering her voice to a desperate whisper. "You can call off the eviction. You can transfer the funds from the trust to save the house. We are your family. Your grandmother would never have wanted you to see us thrown out on the street. You have to tell the judge you made a mistake. You have to drop the eviction and give us the money before the district attorney gets involved. Please, Claire. How could you ruin us over a simple misunderstanding?" I stood perfectly still, letting her words hang in the cold air of the corridor. I looked at her tear-stained face, and then shifted my gaze to my father, who was still standing by the doors, staring at the floor in defeated silence. They were not sorry for the fraud. They were not sorry for stealing my identity, ruining my credit, or attempting to legally strip me of my human rights. They were only sorry that they had been caught. They truly believed that because I shared their blood, I owed them my absolute destruction so they could survive. I reached up and calmly adjusted the lapels of my charcoal blazer. The simple physical movement felt incredibly grounding. I looked my mother directly in the eyes, stripping away every ounce of daughterly submission I had ever harbored. "I did not destroy it," I said, my voice perfectly level and echoing clearly against the stone walls. "You destroyed it when you decided my only purpose was to fund Brandon failures." Patricia flinched, stepping back as if she had been physically struck, but I did not stop. I refused to let her control the narrative for one more second. "You stood in a federal courtroom and committed perjury." I continued, my tone devoid of any sympathy or anger. "You swore under oath that I was mentally incompetent just so you could steal my inheritance to pay off the debts of a son who has never worked a day in his life. You stole my identity when I was in college. You drained my savings to pay for his wedding. You built an entire life on fraud and financial abuse, and you expected me to just quietly absorb the cost. I am not the one who gambled away your retirement accounts. I am not the one who stopped paying the mortgage. I am not the one who forced Jasmine to walk out of that courtroom. You and Richard made those choices. You dug this grave with your own two hands. But you have all that money! Patricia cried out, her voice desperate and shrill. You do not even need it. We are going to lose everything. You already lost everything. I corrected her, stepping forward so she was forced to look at me. And you lost it because of your own greed. Grandma Beatrice saw exactly who you were. That is why she put me in charge. She knew you would try to bleed the estate dry to protect your golden child. You thought you could just bully me into handing over the keys to the kingdom. You thought I was still the terrified young girl who would take the blame for your crimes. But I am not. I just stopped paying for the illusion. I held her gaze until she finally looked away, unable to withstand the absolute finality in my eyes. I turned to my father, raising my voice slightly so it would carry to where he stood trembling by the doors. Do not ever attempt to contact me again, I told him. Do not call me. Do not show up at my home. Do not send lawyers. If you or Brandon attempt to circumvent the eviction or interfere with the trust in any capacity, my next call will be to the federal authorities to expedite their fraud investigation. You are entirely on your own. I did not wait for a response. There was nothing left to say. I turned my back on the people who had brought me into the world and nodded to Mr. Davies. We walked down the long marble corridor together, our footsteps falling in perfect synchronized rhythm. I did not look back over my shoulder. I listened as Patricia's hysterical sobbing faded into a distant, pathetic echo behind us, leaving them standing completely alone in the wreckage of their own making. We pushed through the heavy revolving doors at the front of the courthouse and stepped out into the damp, chilling air. The driving rain had finally slowed to a steady, cleansing drizzle, washing the grime from the city streets. Mr. Davies opened his umbrella and walked me to where my car was parked along the curb. He shook my hand firmly, a silent gesture of profound professional respect, before turning toward his own vehicle. I slid into the driver's seat of my car, pulling the heavy door shut and sealing myself inside the quiet, insulated cabin. I let out a long breath, watching the rain slide down the windshield. Out of habit, I reached into my purse and pulled out my smartphone. On any other day following a family dispute, my screen would be overflowing with notifications. There would be dozens of missed calls from Richard, frantic guilt-tripping text messages from Patricia, and angry entitled demands from Brandon flooding the family group chat. I unlocked the screen and looked at my notifications. The screen was completely blank. My phone was entirely silent. The harassing texts had stopped. The threats were gone. The suffocating pressure that had dictated my every waking moment had simply vanished. I set the phone down in the cup holder and placed my hands on the steering wheel. The silence in the car was beautiful. The realization washed over me, bringing a profound, staggering sense of peace. It was truly over. The war was won, and the rest of my life was finally mine. The silence in the cabin of my car was not empty. It was heavy with the profound, vibrating energy of absolute liberation. I watched the rain streak across the windshield, blurring the imposing facade of the courthouse into a gray wash. For the first time in 34 years, I was not bracing for the next crisis, the next demand, or the next cruel manipulation. Over the following months, the storm that had raged inside that courtroom spilled out into the real world, systematically dismantling the elaborate, fraudulent empire my family had spent decades building. The district attorney did not ignore Judge Abernathy's referral. Within 3 weeks, a formal investigation into my parents' financial maneuvers and their perjured affidavits was initiated. They were forced to hire criminal defense attorneys, draining the absolute last drops of whatever hidden liquidity they had managed to squirrel away. The collapse of Brandon's manufactured reality was the swiftest and most brutal. Stripped of his premium office suite, his luxury car, and the endless stream of capital flowing from our parents' stolen funds, he was left with nothing but his own incompetence. Without the Beatrice Sterling Heritage Trust subsidizing his facade, his architectural consulting firm dissolved overnight. He had no real clients, no legitimate contracts, and no marketable skills. I heard through the property management company that he had packed the entire contents of his thriving business into 3 medium-sized cardboard boxes. He did not leave with dignity. He left with his tail tucked between his legs, escorted off the premises by building security when he tried to bypass the lockout order to retrieve a stolen espresso machine. Jasmine followed through on every single promise she made in that courtroom. She filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and financial abuse, securing full custody of their child, and successfully insulating herself from the catastrophic debt Brandon had accumulated in his own name. She did not ask me for money, nor did I offer it. We both understood that clean breaks required absolute independence. However, on a quiet Tuesday morning, shortly after the divorce was finalized, my phone chimed with a brief text message from her. "Thank you for being the catalyst. I am finally breathing again. Wishing you the best." I smiled, typed a quick, sincere reply, wishing her the same, and permanently deleted Brandon's contact information from my phone. For Richard and Patricia, the reckoning was a slow, agonizing descent into the very reality they had mocked for years. The massive second mortgage they had secretly taken out to fund Brandon's gambling finally caught up with them. To stave off a highly public foreclosure and pay their mounting legal defense fees, they were forced to put the family home on the market. The sprawling, pristine colonial where I had grown up, the ultimate monument to my father's ego and my mother's obsession with social status, was sold at a significant loss to a corporate developer who planned to gut it. They liquidated their luxury vehicles, auctioned off Patricia's curated antique collections, and downsized to a cramped 2-bedroom condo in a noisy working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The ultimate poetic justice of their situation was inescapable. Because Brandon was utterly bankrupt and completely unemployable, he had no choice but to move into that tiny condo with them. The golden child was now permanently trapped in 1,000 square feet of cheap drywall with the enablers who had ruined him. They were locked together in a prison of their own making, drowning in resentment, and forced to stare at each other every single day, knowing exactly who was to blame for their destruction. I felt no guilt watching their empire crumble from a distance. I felt no urge to save them. I had spent my entire adult life trying to stop their ship from sinking. Now I simply stood safely on the shore and watched it go down. With the suffocating weight of my family's expectations permanently lifted, my own life expanded in ways I had never allowed myself to imagine. I took full, unhindered control of the Beatrice Sterling Heritage Trust, approaching my grandmother's legacy not as a dormant savings account, but as a living, breathing engine for real opportunity. I spent weeks meticulously reviewing the property portfolios, optimizing investments, and clearing out the dead weight my family had previously tried to exploit. My primary focus became Suite 400, the premium downtown office space that Brandon had illegally occupied and completely disrespected. Walking into that space after his eviction was a revelation. It was a beautiful, sprawling floor with massive floor-to-ceiling windows and exposed brick completely wasted on a man who spent his days browsing offshore betting sites. I hired a commercial contracting team to completely gut the interior. We tore up the pretentious dark carpets, knocked down the isolating executive walls Brandon had erected, and opened the space up to the natural light. Over the next 6 months, I transformed the floor into the Beatrice, a high-end subsidized co-working and incubator space designed exclusively for female entrepreneurs and women-led startups. I used the capital from the trust to provide premium amenities, state-of-the-art technology, and heavily discounted lease agreements for women who were building actual legitimate businesses but lacked the initial capital to secure premium downtown real estate. I wanted to create an environment that fostered the exact opposite of everything my brother represented. Instead of a monument to unearned entitlement and toxic ego, the building became a vibrant, thriving hub of genuine hard work, collaboration, and earned success. The grand opening of the Beatrice was a milestone that shifted my entire professional trajectory. Standing in the sunlit atrium surrounded by brilliant driven women who were launching tech platforms, opening design firms, and building legal practices, I felt my grandmother's presence radiating through the room. I was no longer just protecting her wealth, I was weaponizing it for good. Simultaneously, my corporate career skyrocketed. Without the exhausting invisible second job of managing my parents' manufactured crises, protecting my credit from their fraud, and absorbing their emotional abuse, I had vast reserves of energy to pour into my own ambitions. My executive board, already impressed by my handling of the company's logistics budget, recognized the sudden explosive shift in my focus and drive. Less than a year after the courtroom confrontation, I was promoted to Senior Vice President of Global Logistics. I was 35 years old, commanding a massive corporate division, managing a multi-million-dollar trust, and running a successful philanthropic real estate venture. I had built a fortress of absolute unshakable security brick by brick on my own terms. The morning air was crisp and carried the faint sweet scent of blooming jasmine from the garden. I sat on the wraparound porch of my Beacon Hill home, the quiet serenity of the historic neighborhood wrapping around me like a protective blanket. The sun was just beginning to crest over the cobblestone streets, casting long golden shadows across the dew-soaked lawn. I held a steaming mug of black coffee between my hands, letting the ceramic warmth seep into my palms. I set my mug down on the small wicker table and picked up my phone, unlocking the screen to open a digital photo album. I tapped on a scanned photograph of Grandma Beatrice. She was younger in the picture, sitting in a wingback chair, looking directly into the camera, with that sharp, knowing half-smile that had always terrified my father. I traced the edge of the screen with my thumb. She knew. She knew exactly what she was doing when she drafted that trust. She didn't just leave me a portfolio of commercial real estate and corporate bonds. She left me a weapon. She gave me the exact tools I needed to sever the chains of my family's financial abuse and force their toxic illusions into the harsh light of reality. She knew that the only way to save me was to give me the power to stop saving them. I took a slow, deep breath of the morning air, feeling the absolute stillness of a life that finally belonged entirely to me. I locked the phone, picked up my coffee, and watched the morning light wash over the city, ready for whatever came next.